Okay, so then we are going to go into passage 2 now. So practice passage 2. So CRISPR-Cas9 technology has the potential to edit the genetic code of humans. As a result, several ethical considerations have arisen. For example, is it ethical to edit the genome of a human embryo? A group of scientists are chosen for a committee to evaluate the ethical considerations of CRISPR-Cas9 technology. Before attending the meeting, all of the scientists across believe that the technology has tremendous potential benefits as an investigative tool, but are extremely cautious and wary of the widespread use of the technology in clinical settings. The scientists are split into two groups, and each group is to come up with a scientific policy recommendation. Before discussing a new policy recommendation, Group 1 is shown a video that graphically displays the dangers of genome editing. Group 1 does not have a time limit to come to a decision. On the other hand, Group 2 is shown a video from the President of the United States emphasizing the speed with which they must arrive at a decision, and they are told that they have 1 hour to arrive at a decision. The evening following the exercise, the groups are asked to present their findings. Group 1 presents a policy entirely denouncing the CRISPR-Cas9 technology and states that the potential negatives significantly outweigh the positives. Group 2, on the other hand, presents an uncreative policy that states regulatory limitations should be created only as problems arise. So, kind of similar to the last passage, but what does the first paragraph tell us? Yeah, so they're introducing the Cas9 technology and mentioning the ethical issues, specifically mentioning here that all the scientists attending the meeting believe that the technology has a lot of potential in terms of benefits, but are also extremely cautious about using it. So just to end on that. So great. And for the second question, so I wanted to also ask, what was the design of the experiment that they used in this passage? Sorry, my question was a little bit misleading. I was just mostly asking about how did they arrange the people in this experiment? And so yes, the answer is into two groups. In terms of like the type of experiment or like the study design, I'm not completely sure, like, I guess how I would define it in terms of cross-sectional versus like cohort versus experimental. I feel like in this case, though, it would be more experimental because you are changing this variable of like the video that's being shown to people in the two groups. So it's not, and like David's saying, cross-sectional studies are at different periods of time, but also for a lot of the observational studies, you're not making any changes to the groups. So like even with cohort studies, with cross-sectional studies, longitudinal studies, you're not introducing a new thing into it. So that's why I feel like I wouldn't categorize it under that. I would feel like it's more like experimental, except just that usually for experimental studies, they also control for a lot of other factors, which they didn't quite do here because it was just a change of the videos, but because they are making this change. I also wanted to ask, what were the findings? Group 1 entirely denounced the technology. Group 2, they, I guess, were trying to, they didn't specifically denounce it, but they just said that there should be limitations if there are any problems. So now we're going to go into our first question. So we have 100% saying C. And for this one, the answer is actually D. So the question asks, which of the following best describes how Group 1 arrived at its policy recommendation? So Group 1, as we remember from the findings, were the group that completely denounced the use of the technology. And so the reason why the answer is choice D, group polarization, is because as a group, they ended up having this really this really big drive to have this like negative decision. And so if you go back to the okay, so if we go back to the passage, we see from the first paragraph, right, that it already mentions that all the scientists in this particular meeting are extremely cautious and they, are wary of this widespread use of CRISPR-Cas9. So they're already like on the fence already. They kind of are very careful about it. And then we see that they're split into two groups. So for group one, they show a video that displays the dangers, like all the potential problems that could go wrong. I mean, all the potential problems with genome editing. And another factor, they say that group one doesn't have a time limit. So at the end, they have that policy that entirely denounces the CRISPR-Cas9. And we can see kind of like a change where they were a little bit wary. They were then shown this video that mainly focuses on the negatives of genome editing. And then they had time to discuss with each other. They didn't have a particular time limit, so they could continue like talking for a really long time. And then they entirely denounced it. So you kind of see the change in their attitude of how it became kind of in the middle to then being polarized to one specific area. And so that's why the answer is the group polarization, because like the term is the idea that when you are in a group and you kind of have people in the group have similar ideas, however, like they may not be as extreme as they could be, as the discussions keep increasing within that group, your opinions, if they're the same with the rest of the group, or if you're like in the middle, kind of like unsure area of it, being in that group itself will cause you to, really have that extreme view of a particular policy. So for in this example, it was related to the negatives of genome editing. And being in that group caused them to entirely denounce it by then. So that's why the answer is D. For C, groupthink is the term is a little bit different. And so groupthink is the term where people believe that when you're in a group, you're more focused on maintaining harmony within that group as opposed to trying to like bring in more questions or problems or arguments with the rest of the group members. It also tends to be that there is like a leader of the group in groupthink, and all of the rest of the people are trying to maintain that harmony with and follow what the leader is kind of sharing in that group. So that's the definition of groupthink. And the bystander effect is more related to when there's like when you're in a city area and someone gets mugged, for example, since there are so many people watching, there is a sense of like diffusion of responsibility. And so then you feel less inclined to act in that situation because you're surrounded by so many people who are doing the same thing, which is probably not acting. And so that's what that is, and not quite related to group one determining its policy recommendation. And then social loafing is when you're, let's say, working in a group project, and because and then there are individuals in that group that are not doing the same amount of work as the other individuals, and rather they're just kind of not doing the work at all because they believe that the other group members will be able to, do the work for the group. But for group two, do you guys understand how then group two would be groupthink? The question asks, which of the following best describes how group two arrived at its policy recommendation? And as we can see from this practice passage, contrary to what group one was experiencing, group 2 was shown a video. So I guess to start off, they also had the people in group 2 also had a similar idea as the rest of the scientists that believe that, the technology has benefit, but they're still cautious. And then they're shown a video from the president emphasizing that they should, arrive at a decision at a specified amount of time. And then at the end, they presented an uncreative, the way the passage describes it, uncreative policy that states regulatory limitations should be created only as problems arise. And so, in relation to this question itself, groupthink, as I previously mentioned, is related to really trying to maintain the harmony of a group. And so, in a lot of cases, when you are under that time pressure, it causes you to want to make that decision as soon as possible within that time frame, because if you're thinking of it, if you keep having the discussion, then it's going to go over the time, and then once it passes the time, no one will be able to say succinctly what their group is thinking about. So that's why the answer is C, groupthink, because with that shortened amount of time, they came up with with a policy, an uncreative policy as described by the passage. And I guess another factor of groupthink is that the policies or the decisions that groups come up with because of groupthink tend to be unproductive. And so I think that uncreative word that they added in there really adds to even more why the answer choice is C, groupthink. So with because of limiting timing, the group 2 leader could only say yes or no, and I don't think anyone else would have wanted to add more questions, because then that would prolong the conversation. So for the other choices, I realized they're all the same choices as before. So group polarization, it would have, polarized their opinions, in which case for group 2, that didn't quite happen. And bystander effect, in relation to not really having a diffusion of responsibility based on the amount of people around you, and social loafing, not putting in the same effort as other people in a group project because you think that, everyone else will be putting in the work. So now for this question, I'll give you guys a minute. So we have 100% saying C. And the answer is C. So a scientist initially rejects the policy recommendation in group 1, but agrees after she realizes that she is outnumbered. This is an example of conformity, and a very good example of conformity, because it tends to be that within a group, like the experiment with the lines before, conformity is really about an individual tending to change their decision in order for it to match with the rest of the group. And this is exactly what the question is describing, because that scientist changes the decision, her decision, because she's outnumbered by the rest of the people there. And so she's conforming to the group surrounding her. So for the other choices, though, a term that's often connected with conformity is obedience, but obedience is a little different in the sense that obedience refers to an individual, following the orders of someone who is like an authoritative figure or like a leader in a sense. And for this particular question, it doesn't mention any person that has more power or more authority. And so that's why B wouldn't be the correct answer. For A, socialization is a term describing like the way that people are, socializing with others, and like the different modes of socialization, whether it be like media, social media, I guess just communication, and like I think anyway, like yeah, so all the different types of ways that can encourage that communication and exchanging of cultures. Um, that is the definition of socialization, which isn't quite related to this question. And social facilitation is when, so this was a term that I felt like confused me or made me sometimes choose the wrong answer a couple of times, but it's related to usually when there's an audience watching an individual performing a task. And what would happen is usually the individual, if the task is easy, the person will perform it really well with that audience around them. However, when it's like a difficult task, it tends to stumble them a little bit more. Also, like if they've been practicing a performance, for example, and they make um, if they're practicing a performance, for example, then the part that or the way that they practice will really influence how they perform in front of their audience. So if they, for example, keep making a mistake at a certain point in the piece for, let's say, a musical performance, then when they have this audience, they'll most likely make this mistake even if they try fixing it at the last minute, because they tend to, go back to their original actions and feel a little bit more nervous because of that audience that's watching them. 100% said C, and that's definitely the correct answer. Great job, you guys. So as I mentioned, agents of socialization, really allowing that exchange of ideas and culture. And so media, definitely peers and family are all individuals and sources where you'll be able to do that. In particular, hunger doesn't quite, it's not considered an agent of socialization. And so that's why C is the correct answer for this question, because you're not quite exchanging information by just being in a state of hunger.